My parents thought that by tossing me out like yesterday's trash, they were teaching me a lesson in humility. They stood there in their designer suits, looking down at my wedding dress with such pure disgust you'd think I'd just set their inheritance on fire. My father's voice didn't even shake when he told me I was no longer a Miller. My mother didn't even blink when she handed me a trash bag filled with my belongings. They told me that without their name, I was nothing. They told me I'd be crawling back within a month, begging for a scrap of their fortune. But as I walked away from that mansion with my husband's hand in mine, I wasn't crying because I was poor. I was smiling because I knew something they didn't. I knew that while they were busy planning my social execution, I had been quietly buying the very ground they stood on. Within the next hour, the Miller Group would no longer belong to the Millers. It would belong to me. I remember the silence of the car ride to the courthouse. No white carriage, no expensive floral arrangements, just the hum of a rusted engine and the man I loved. Mark looked at me, his eyes full of worry, asking if I was sure. He knew what I was giving up, or at least he thought he knew. He thought I was choosing a life of struggle over a life of luxury. What he didn't realize was that I had been preparing for this day since I was 16. I grew up in a house where love was a transaction and loyalty was a line item on a balance sheet. I knew exactly how my parents operated. They didn't see people, they saw assets and liabilities. And the moment I chose a man who didn't come with a multi-million-dollar trust fund, I became a liability that needed to be liquidated. The wedding was small, cold, and perfect. No cameras, no fake smiles from socialites, just a judge and 2 witnesses. But as I signed that marriage certificate, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a notification from my lead broker. The final shares had been cleared. The shell company I had spent years building under a legal pseudonym now held 51% of Miller Global. While my father was likely sitting in his study, sipping a 20-year-old scotch and laughing about how he'd finally broken my spirit, I was officially his boss. The next few weeks were a blur of calculated silence. Mark and I moved into a cramped apartment on the edge of the city. He worked double shifts at the garage, thinking we were barely making rent, while I spent my nights on encrypted calls with board members who were tired of my father's ego. My parents had blocked my number, blocked my credit cards, and sent a mass email to everyone in our circle, effectively erasing me from existence. They wanted me to feel the weight of being a nobody. They wanted me to feel the cold sting of poverty. Every time I saw a news alert about the Miller Group's fluctuating stock, I felt a rush of adrenaline. They were desperate. The company was bleeding and they were looking for a savior. Little did they know, the savior they were praying for was the daughter they had disowned at the altar. I wasn't just going to take their money, I was going to take their pride. By the time the 3rd week rolled around, my parents had grown bold in their cruelty. They didn't just ignore me, they actively tried to bury me. I heard through a former assistant that my mother had held a charity gala where she told everyone I had moved to Europe in shame. They were rewriting the narrative to protect their image, ensuring that the elite of the city saw my absence as a failure rather than a choice. Meanwhile, Mark was coming home with grease under his fingernails and exhaustion in his eyes, apologizing that we could only afford frozen dinners. It broke my heart to keep him in the dark, but this had to be surgical. If a single word leaked, my father's legal team would find a way to tie up the acquisition in court for decades. I needed the element of surprise. I needed them to be at their absolute lowest point so that the impact would be irreversible. The Miller Group was a titan of industry, but it was built on a foundation of cards. My father had spent the last decade over-leveraging their assets to fund a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford. They were hollowed out, surviving only on the reputation of the name. I watched from my laptop in our tiny kitchen as the stock price dipped below the critical threshold. My father was panicking. He began calling emergency meetings with the board, begging for an infusion of capital. He reached out to every old money contact he had, but I had already been there. My associates had spent months whispering in the ears of the city's power players, warning them that the Miller ship was sinking. By the time my father asked for help, the doors were already locked. He was isolated exactly like he had tried to make me, I received the email on a Tuesday morning. It was an urgent summons for an extraordinary board meeting. The agenda was simple: the formal introduction of the new majority shareholder and a vote on the removal of the current CEO. My father hadn't been told who the buyer was. He likely assumed it was some faceless private equity firm from New York or a rival conglomerate looking to strip the company for parts. He had no idea that the enemy was currently sitting in a laundromat, folding Mark's work shirts and drinking lukewarm coffee. I felt a cold, sharp sense of clarity. The injustice of my wedding day, the way my mother had pulled her skirts away from me as if I were a leper, the way my father had told the security guards to escort me off the property, it all burned in the back of my throat. They had taught me that the only thing that mattered was power. Fine, I would show them what real power looked like. I spent that evening preparing. I didn't reach for the couture dresses they had bought me. I went out and bought a sharp, slate gray suit from a department store, something modern, professional, and entirely unlike the socialite image they had tried to force upon me. Mark was working late again, so I left a note on the table telling him I had a big job interview. In a way, it was the truth. It was an interview for the position of the woman who would finally hold her family accountable. As I looked at myself in the cracked mirror of our bathroom, I didn't see the heartbroken girl who had been disowned. I saw a shark. I saw the person who was about to walk into the lion's den and walk out with the lion's head. The stage was set, the shares were locked, and the board was waiting. It was time to go home. The morning of the board meeting was overcast, matching the cold atmosphere I knew I would find inside the Miller Global headquarters. I didn't take a town car or a private driver. I took the subway, sitting among the everyday people my parents spent their lives looking down upon. When I stepped into the lobby of the skyscraper that bore my name, the security guard, a man who had seen me grow up, didn't even recognize me in my sharp suit and pulled back hair. I checked in as the representative of Vanguard Holdings. The receptionist gave me a polite, professional nod, having no clue she was looking at the woman whose picture had been removed from the company's family heritage wall just weeks prior. I took the elevator to the penthouse floor, the silence of the ascent feeling like the calm before a hurricane. When the doors opened, I could hear my father's voice echoing from the boardroom. He was shouting. He was always shouting when he was losing control. I stood outside the heavy oak doors for a moment, listening to him blame the market, blame the board, and blame the vulture who was trying to steal his legacy. He sounded desperate. He sounded small. I pushed the doors open slowly and the room went dead silent. My father was at the head of the table, his face flushed red, while my mother sat in the corner in a pristine Chanel suit, looking like she was attending a funeral. They both looked at me, confusion flickering across their faces before the recognition hit. My mother's hand flew to her throat, and my father's jaw dropped so low I thought it might hit the mahogany table. I didn't wait for them to speak. I walked to the only empty chair, the one directly opposite my father, and set my leather portfolio down with a heavy thud. The board members, most of whom I had spent months courting in secret, stayed silent, watching the drama unfold with bated breath. My father finally found his voice, sputtering that this was a private meeting and demanding that security be called to remove me. He called me a child playing dress-up. He told the room I was a disgruntled former relative looking for a handout. I let him rant until he ran out of breath, his chest heaving as he stared at me with pure venom. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I just reached into my portfolio and pulled out the certified share registry. I slid the documents across the table until they tapped against his gold-plated nameplate. I told him to look at the name of the majority owner of Vanguard Holdings. As his eyes scanned the legal text, I watched the color drain from his face until he was as white as the paper he was holding. He looked at me, then back at the document, then at the board members who refused to meet his gaze. I informed the room that as of 9 o'clock this morning, the Miller family no longer held a controlling interest in this firm. I announced that my first act as the new owner was to call for a vote on the immediate termination of the CEO and the chief operating officer, my father and my mother. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. The look on my mother's face was one I would never forget. The arrogance that had defined her for decades vanished, replaced by a hollow, trembling fear. She tried to stand, her voice cracking as she called me by my childhood nickname, pleading that there must be some mistake. But there were no mistakes in business. My father, however, didn't plead. He exploded. He lunged across the table, calling me a traitor and screaming that he had built this empire from nothing. I calmly reminded him that he hadn't built it alone. He had built it on the backs of people he stepped on, including his own daughter. I told him that the moment he disowned me at my wedding was the moment he signed away his right to this legacy. I wasn't the traitor, I was the consequence. The board vote was unanimous. Within 10 minutes, security, the same men who had escorted me out of my parents' house, were standing in the boardroom to escort my parents out of their own company. My father tried to grab his personal items, but I stopped him. I informed him that everything in this office belonged to the corporation now, including the furniture he sat on and the car waiting for him in the garage. They walked out of that building with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the bitter realization that their penniless daughter was now their landlord. As the doors closed behind them, I finally took a seat at the head of the table. I didn't feel the rush of greed I expected. I felt a profound sense of peace. The cycle of using people as assets was over. I went home that evening to our small apartment. Mark was sitting at the table, looking at a pile of bills and looking defeated. I sat down across from him and placed a set of keys on the table. Not keys to the mansion, but keys to a beautiful, modest house in a neighborhood he actually liked. I told him the truth, everything from the shell company to the board meeting. He didn't care about the money, he was just stunned that I had carried that weight alone to protect our future. He held me, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could actually breathe. I had my husband, I had my dignity, and I had the resources to ensure that no one would ever treat us like a liability again. A week later, a letter arrived from my parents. It was a formal apology written by a lawyer, asking for a family reconciliation and a monthly allowance to maintain their lifestyle. They claimed they had realized their mistake and missed their daughter. I didn't even finish reading it. I knew they didn't miss me, they missed the power I now held. I didn't send a letter back. I simply sent a copy of my wedding photo, the one where they were turning their backs on me, with a short note written on the back. It said, "You told me I was nothing without your name. It turns out your name was nothing without me." I haven't spoken to them since, and for the first time in my life, I am exactly where I belong.